For the moment, we are going to take a pause from the battles that are going on during the Battle of Perryville. Next week, the battle will take place in the town itself with hand-to-hand combat. In this week's video, we will discuss what happened to the Russell House, the other farm that was in the middle of several battles. While we will not be covering the battles around the house, they can be found in our playlist with the different battles that had taken place. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Their pre-battle Russell family fortunes. John Russell was a 39-year-old who was married to Frances Russell, who was 40 years old. Together, they had 8 children. Isafina, 15, Amanda, 13, and Susan, 10, John, 8, Waller, 6, George, 4, and Sarah, 2. Living in the house with the Russell family was Frances's mother, Susan Bailey Laws, who was 82 years old. Also in the house was a farmhand named Ashbury May, who was 18 years old. Ashbury and Isafina had plans to marry at the time that the Civil War had broken out. So their plans were delayed as Ashbury served in the Union Army in the 63rd Indiana Union Infantry. The couple would eventually marry on October 29, 1866. The Russell family lived in a little white house that sat on 150 acres near Perryville, Kentucky. The 2-story framed house stood on a little ridge south of Mackville Road and was east of the Dixville Crossroads. The Russell home became a huge strategic vantage point as it had a huge view of the fields and valleys below to the right of the front of the side of the house. And it also overlooked a wooded area to the left. This would be perfect during the battle to see everything that would take place. At the time of the battle, the value of John Russell's fortune was mostly in real estate at a value of $2,000, and his personal property was valued at $1,553. John owned no slaves, and like Henry Bottom, was loyal to the Union cause. The Russell farm had 20 acres in corn, 15 acres in wheat, and 6 acres of meadow, and oats were also grown on the land. Time to flee. According to the Russell House source, a niece of John Russell by the name of Alice Matilda Laws relays the following story. On the morning of October 8, 1862, John Russell began his day just like any other day on the farm. There were animals to feed and cows to milk, and etc. Just as Russell began feeding his hogs, a man ran toward him. The man yelled for Russell to put down his slop buckets, catch and hitch up his horse as fast as he could, tell the women and children to head for the schoolhouse. Now, it is never really stated which school the Russell family ran to. It is supposed that it was the Harmonia School, but there is no evidence that they ever held up there during the battle. However, the family did reach the safety of the school just as the Union soldiers arrived on the farm. How the house changed during the battle. While most of our battles concerning the area around Russell House have already been discussed, we will only cover the defensive lines and damages done and by who in this section of the story. Union General Alexander McCook, commander of the 1st Corps under the Union General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, along with his 3rd Division commander, Union General Lovell Rousseau, arrived at the home at 4 p.m. They immediately began setting up their lines of defense around the house. Little and Harris formed their troops into a picket line, which began at the Russell House. Captain Cyrus Loomis, 1st Michigan Battery from the Dixville Crossroads, were placed 500 yards to the rear of the Russell House. With everything now in place, the men had nothing to do but wait for the battle to begin. Shells began to rain down upon the Russell family home from the Confederate Cavalry's battery from General Patrick Claiborne's brigade and from Union Simpson's battery. To get a better view and aim against the enemy, the 1st Regiment of the Engineers and Mechanics were ordered to take a position against the fence line. To make way for the artillery, the fence was taken up in a hurry. Colonel George Humphrey of the 88th Indiana and his troops formed a line behind the Russell House to the left of Loomis Battery. Colonel Coram Polk of the 15th Kentucky Union Infantry formed his line east of the house to support Hotchkiss Battery. The battles continued around Russell House all day until the sun set in the west, at which time the fighting stopped on account of darkness. Dr. Jefferson J. Polk's assessment. According to our source, Dixville Crossroads, in his autobiography in 1867, Jefferson J. Polk, a local physician, wrote the following, quote, I passed on northward and saw on either hand dead men and dead horses, canteens, muskets, cartridge boxes, broken ambulances, coats, hats, and shoes, scattered thick over the ground. I reached Mr. Russell's White House. Here was the center of a great battle. The house was dotted over with hundreds of marks of muskets and cannonballs. All around lay dead bodies of soldiers. In a skirt of woods close by were scattered hundreds of dead of both armies. The ground was strewn with soiled and torn clothes, muskets, blankets, and other various accoutrements of the dead soldiers. Trees not more than a foot in diameter contained from 20 to 30 musket balls and buckshot put into them during the battle. I counted 410 dead men on a small spot of ground. My heart grew sick at the sight. I saw dead rebels piled up in pens like hogs. I reached my home, praying to God that I might never again be called upon to visit a battlefield. Unquote. The family returns to their home. It took a few days for the Russell family to gain the courage to come back home again. What met their eyes was a scene out of a horror movie. There were still bodies scattered everywhere. But an even worse shock came when they entered into the house itself. Also, according to Susan Matilda Laws Taylor, Susan Bailey Laws became deathly ill from exposure during their time in the schoolhouse, as snow had fell a few days after the battle was over. But before the return of the family to the home, Laws died from her illness during the winter of 1862. The Union Army surgeons had used the house as a makeshift hospital for 17 days. Because of the number of casualties that were coming through, there was not enough time to be organized. Basically, after an amputation, the discarded parts were simply chucked out of a window on the first floor. Isafina took on the duties of cleaning up the mess that the surgeons had left behind. She would use a pitchfork to pick up the amputated parts and loaded 2 or 3 wagons worth of the mess. There was a ditch between the Russell and Overstreet farms. Isafina would plow out this ditch and bury the human parts. There is a story where Isafina was taking a break sitting on a log when she heard the groans of a wounded soldier. She took pity upon the soldier and brought him to the house and nursed him back to health. Years later, the son of the soldier came to the farm and asked to pitch a tent for a few days on the property. After speaking to the son, she realized which soldier he had come to honor, the very one that she had nursed back to health. The area around the farm was in utter ruins. Not only was the house in shambles, but the army destroyed or took just about everything else. According to the Russell House website, this included, quote, 30 cords of wood, 40 barrels of corn, 2,000 bundles of sheaf wheat, 1,000 pounds of hay, and 4 horses which were valued at $845. The corn was taken from his field. General Joshua Seal's division burned 100 panels of rail fence, using them as fuel. Francis Russell had a lot of fine walnut and mahogany furniture, but every piece was destroyed. The furniture had been used as firewood, and the drawers were used to feed the horses. All of her chest drawers, full of sheets, table covers, pillow slips, and many other linens, along with homespun heirlooms, had been torn apart and used by the doctors as bandages. The window lighters were all broken out. The Union Army gave no receipts or vouchers to John Russell for everything they took from the farm. Unquote. In 1884, John Russell did file claims for the damages to his farm during the Battle of Perryville. The quartermaster general informed John Russell that his claim of $845 was not allowed because Russell had no proof that the Union government had done this amount of damage or taken anything from the farm. It has been said that because the floors of the house were made of ash, that they had soaked up the blood from the amputations, and each time it rained, the floors would turn dark blood red. And this is said to have occurred all the way through to the 20th century. The dead soldiers. It is thought that the soldiers were buried in 150 locations, with as many as 120 of those locations being on the battlefield. According to the Russell House source, quote, H.P. Bottom, John Russell, and David Wilkerson buried the bodies in 20 trenches, containing 5 to 29 bodies each, totaling 322 bodies. There were also 8 hospital trenches, containing 15 to 55 bodies each, totaling 260 bodies. Unquote. In 1867, Union General George Thomas ordered all of the Union dead to be moved to the Perryville National Cemetery on Peters Hill, overlooking the Springfield Road. Edmund Whitman was charged with finding all of the bodies and having them moved. Going through all of the possible graves on the property, Whitman was able to identify 969 bodies. This meant that 2/3 of the Union soldiers could not be identified. After all of the burials had taken place, later on that year, there was a land dispute over the Perryville National Cemetery. The land was now tied up in the courts with legal wills being probated. Because of this, the cemetery had to be closed, and all of the bodies were once again moved, this time to Camp Nelson Cemetery in Jessamine County, Kentucky, to be reinterred. So, what happened to all of the Confederate soldiers? They were either buried in a mass pit by Henry Bottom, which still exists today on the Perryville Battlefield State Historical Site. Around 200 Confederate soldiers were buried in an unmarked mass grave at the Goodnight Cemetery. Or the residents of Perryville would dig a hole and take a fence rail or post and roll the soldiers into an unmarked grave. What happened to the farm? On November 25th, 1896, John Russell passed away. He left his estate to his children and his wife who preceded him in death. Isafina and her husband Ashbury May were able to purchase the shares from her siblings to gain ownership of the farm. Upon her death, Isafina willed the farm to Rutherford B. Hayes. Sometime later, Hayes May and his wife Anna Wayne had ownership of the land until his death in 1957. They in turn willed their house to their daughter, Rachel May, who was married to Seymour Clonch. Shortly after their deaths in 1969, the land went to their daughter, Anna Lee, who was married to Clarence Sharp. The land was finally willed again in 1976 to Hazel Sharp, who was married to Russell Townsend. In 2009, Hazel's children sold the property. The Russell house itself was burned down as a prank on Halloween night, 1964. It took a generation for the residents of Perryville to get over the emotional upheaval of the battle. The land and the trees could not be used for farming or wood because of the bodies buried everywhere. The trees were deemed unusable because of the artillery cannonballs and muskets that had been buried in the wood. Thank you. Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Civil War battles. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Please be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.